Okay, great. Look, it's a pleasure to be here. Really great to be here with Jennifer McCaney. Both of us are from UCLA, and I'm going to attempt to introduce my colleague Jennifer here. And so, Jennifer is the co-executive director of UCLA Biodesigm. She's got appointments across UCLA. She's a faculty member in the Department of Medicine. She's also a faculty member in the David Geffen, the Anderson School of Management as well. She's been an entrepreneur. She's been a co-founder of Hourglass Technologies. She's launched accelerators before, like the MedTech Innovator Accelerator. And just like her UCLA affiliations are across campus, it seems like her educational background, really traverses across the schools. She has got like a bachelor's from MIT Sloan, which is the management school. She's got a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from MIT, a master's degree in mechanical engineering from MIT, a master's in bioengineering from University of New South Wales, a PhD in mechanical engineering from Stanford. So I probably forgot a few degrees there, but that is one impressive bio, Jennifer. So really happy to be sharing the stage with you today.
Thanks, Achuta, and equal praise to Achuta Kadambi, who's also, as you mentioned, a colleague at UCLA in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. Coincidentally, Achuta is also an MIT alum, where he received his PhD, and a co-founder of Akasha Imaging, which is, I think we're going to talk a little bit about later, so I won't kind of spoil too much there, but it's a robotics and AI company based in Silicon Valley that's based on some of the work in his lab, which really focuses on teaching robots how to see the world by building cameras and algorithms. Some of his recent inventions include cameras that can see around corners, ultra-low dose X-ray imaging systems. And in particular, Achuta was recently elected to the National Academy of Inventors, so congratulations for that, as well as he's been cited on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list last year. So really a pleasure to be joining you as well, and look forward to the discussion today about the entrepreneurial scientist.
Awesome.
So I think I'll kick off the questions to you, since it's very clear that you're the AI expert in this pair. And I think it's probably best to do some level setting in terms of, AI means different things to different people. And so as a leading researcher and a key opinion leader in the field, how do you define AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the great thing about being a professor is that you can let your students define it. So I teach a class called Artificial Intelligence, or AI, for Future CEOs. And it's geared towards undergraduates at UCLA. And the very first question I actually ask the students is, how do you define AI? So we hear kind of a range of answers. There's no right or wrong answer, but some of the common elements are kind of teaching machines to do human tasks, teaching machines to reason about the world, or sometimes teaching machines how to go beyond human capabilities. And in that framework, we can't really define AI because it's beyond human capabilities. So there's a variety of ways to define AI, and there's no right or wrong answer. At some point, we do get down into brass tacks because it is, technically an electrical engineering course. And we say that AI today is more like applying machine learning techniques and machine learning models. So that's kind of my definition of AI. But, Jennifer, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm going to remember that if I take your class one day, that we can't define AI because it's beyond human capabilities. So I'll keep that one in my back pocket. But certainly, when I think about AI from the context of healthcare, it's really about continual learning and refinement of algorithms. And really, on the front end of that, we think about the changes in business models and enterprise level systems that AI is driving in the industry side. So really what we're seeing are fundamentally new businesses, new business models being created. And that's coming from both the data being generated in healthcare, we have our electronic medical record and the rise of wearable devices that are generating data. But that data is really creating value because we have AI capabilities and machine learning capabilities to refine and garner insights from that data.
Awesome. So if I were to, pitch you a question to follow this up, like which specific industries or sectors do you think are most advanced in terms of AI? Which sectors are largest? Who has most to gain from efficiencies?
Yeah, certainly when we think of efficiency, healthcare always falls at the top of everyone's list. We all know that healthcare is encroaching on 20% of our annual GDP here in the US. And certainly when we think about removing humans from the equation, medical error is actually one of the leading causes of death specifically in AI is technology that has a component to potentially address some errors associated with perhaps medical diagnosis or other spectrums across the healthcare ecosystem. I think in particular, when we're thinking about AI and what it means to different industries in terms of healthcare, we've seen initial entry points in imaging as well as clinical decision support. And kind of further down the road, we're going to continue to see more and more introductions in terms of clinical diagnosis, or kind of giving the AI more capability, more power as it moves down the spectrum in the healthcare sector. But certainly, I'll let you expound on other aspects of AI in other industries.
Well, no, I mean, I totally agree with you that AI and health is one of the most ripe intersections, and it's a field that is definitely on the growth. But beyond health, I think definitely if you look at the grand challenges, I recently looked at the National Academy of Engineering. Every year they release their kind of grand challenges for what engineers should be thinking of. I kind of made an exercise to myself to see, okay, which one would AI not apply to, and I couldn't find one. So we're seeing AI across the School of Engineering being applied to the design of new materials. We're seeing it being applied to transportation systems, the autonomous car being a notable example. We're seeing, and of course, I think the biggest one and the most exciting one is AI being applied to health. So I think, in that lens, almost every undergraduate at the School of Engineering now has this real excitement to learn more about AI. And they come to us as faculty, right, to ask them, how they want to position a career in AI. How do they build their career for the next 10 to 20 years? So I'm sure you get that question often, Jennifer, from the UCLA students. So how do you answer it? What advice do you give to current UCLA students who are interested in pursuing a career in AI?
Yeah, Achuta, that's a great question. I think that I can speak to both our approach from the business school and the medical school, because we've had significant efforts in both areas. At UCLA Anderson, we actually have a new master's in business analytics program, which is an opportunity for students looking to really gain some deep fundamental expertise. But again, looking a little bit further downstream, like I talked about earlier, in terms of understanding, being able to be that liaison between the data scientist and the business strategist, and being able to drive data decisions within a business operation. And certainly also within the MBA program in Anderson, we have multiple course offerings that really address data analytics for managers. At the end of the day, your technical expertise is less about the program or the language in which you can code, and it's more about the business insights, which are going to be independent of the platform or technology. It's kind of in the underbelly or of the algorithm per se. When we're thinking about training, medical scientists, we have a clinical informatics program at UCLA that's quite robust. We have a fellowship with 5 full-time slots for informatics fellows, and we have an additional informatics program for our residents as well that's led by our CIO, Mike Pfeffer. And it's really quite amazing what we're able to empower our physicians with the power of the electronic medical record to improve efficiencies, as well as think about new careers for MD students and MD trainees.
Awesome. No, I think that's definitely a very exciting area. So I think you've covered a lot in AI and health. And if I were just kind of add on to that in terms of kind of everything else, I gave some examples about how it cuts across all facets of the engineering school. But I think what we're going into with AI, at least as a faculty member doing research, I think what's really at the frontier is going beyond human capabilities and understanding. And I call that the unknown problem. When we use AI to solve for something that we know is unknown, like a diagnosis of a known disease, then you feed it enough data and you hope kind of that the model converges. And there's obviously a lot of challenges to make that happen. But what if there's an unknown disease that you don't know how to diagnose, but you want the machine not only to learn things about this disease, but also you want it to solve the problem of diagnosis. So you're solving an unknown. So I think the next frontier of AI, at least in our classes, what we're moving towards is where AI models start to teach kind of humans how to conduct their procedures, how to conduct what they do. It's like almost like AI serves as the teacher for humans. Right now with supervised learning, it's the opposite, right? Humans are labeling and by hand the data sets that are going into an AI model. What if the AI model is actually coming back and teaching us more about the world around us? So I think this is really great. So Now, I
I
mean,
think this is also, this is becoming the AI and philosophy session as well. We'll have to have a little back end for the philosophy component of the talk. But certainly, I think those are great points you make. And, thinking about the unknown, I know kind of specific to your work, looking at cameras and robots. The old adage is that a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And so you're working with robots and cameras on a daily basis. What's the unknown there, and how much data are you generating to look at, and what's known and unknown in a single image? Because it feels like there's a lot more there than what meets the eye.
Yeah. Okay. So to your first point about philosophy, totally agree. That's why we get like a doctorate of philosophy and engineering. I think both of us have one of these. And I think it's just philosophy in bigger letters than engineering, at least on mine. To your second point about a picture being worth 1,000 words, I would even say that when it comes to modern cameras, a picture is worth like 1,000,000 words, because if you look at it, a picture has 1,000,000 pixels, each of which can have, 8 bits of data just in that one pixel. So you got these, millions of pixels, and it's not possible for a human, when we see a photo, to look at individual pixels or neighborhood of pixels and make inference. But it's really surprising that some of these machines and robots can find like minute details and edges to do tasks more precisely than humans. One example that we're looking at is for robotic surgery, where the robot can see exactly where the incision should go to micrometer precision, which the human eye and the human hand, to a degree, we don't have micrometer precision. Of course, we have excellent surgeons at UCLA, so you should still go there and get your procedures done. But I think that's one area where robots may aid the philosophy. I think if I were to just segue a little bit, Jennifer, maybe we agree now, at least partway through the call, that we've discussed some philosophy. We agree that AI and health really super important, but as especially yourself as a faculty member, you go beyond discussions, you go into action. And so you have some really exciting concrete initiatives at UCLA to really grow this intersection of health and tech. Can you speak to some of the exciting trends that you are spearheading on campus?
Yes, certainly, Achuta. It's a great question. I think reflective of kind of the, kind of as a nation and a global citizen, we're really driven to address healthcare right now as really some other social issues that are affecting everyone as a downstream result of COVID-19. I think that one of the pieces to really address great change is to bring together many disciplines. And that's really one of the strengths of UCLA, is that we're able to bring together so many disciplines. And to that note, where I'm the co-lead of UCLA Biodesigm, which you mentioned earlier, along with Desert Horse Grant, who heads up research and innovation at UCLA Health. And we're really an interdisciplinary training program for areas of great need, and most specifically healthcare. And so one of the ways that we've done that here at UCLA is we bring together the medical school, the business school, and the health system, as well as outstanding faculty like yourself from the engineering side, who are able to bring faculties to urgent needs in healthcare. This year in particular, in our UCLA Biodesigm program, we're really focused on therapeutic areas affected by COVID-19. So we're taking a long, hard look at pulmonary care, critical care medicine, intensive care, right? So what's happening in the ICU. We're also looking a little further upstream. We're looking at infection prevention, infection control. We're talking to members of the community, members of the educational system, those that are impacted by socioeconomic factors related to COVID-19. And so through that process, we're really looking at identifying significant unmet needs in the healthcare system, again, with a particular focus on those impacted by COVID-19. But with a larger lens, UCLA Biodesign is really building upon the strengths of the UCLA system. UCLA, as you know, and I know, is currently ranked the #1 public university in the nation, and for good reason. And then when you couple that with the #4 health system in the nation, UCLA Health, as well as our leading business school and other faculties, it's really a great place to do innovative work.
Awesome. Yeah, I think this intersection between health and AI is kind of also like a microcosm of a bigger trend in engineering. Health is a problem that people care about. We care about our health to a degree. And we're seeing that this modern engineer, especially the younger generation of students, there's definitely strong engineers, not to take away from their engineering talent at all, but they have something unique. They come in with this mindset to really transform society. So they're really looking at social impact. Health is one of the channels of social impact, and so we see a lot of exciting inventions and developments going on in that intersection. If I were to just put one level deeper on tech and healthcare, a lot of the ideas that you mentioned, whether it's like imaging, data, radiology that you touched on, clinical records, this is data. So one of the drivers between this convergence of tech and healthcare appears to be data. And since the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, healthcare has seen this enormous influx of data. So how do you see AI, empowering this data to drive new insights? Are there ways to do things that were previously difficult or impossible? Does this increase equity? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll take the business side, and then I'll hand it back off to you for the mechanics of how we actually do that on the AI side. But certainly, even UCLA ourselves, we just spun out a VCS AI just this past year, which is an AI-based company looking at X-ray imaging for spine and neurosurgery, and that's really based upon a lot of the work that was done here by Dr. Luke McCazian. And I'm happy to share that Theseus actually is just about to close a seed round. They're based up in Silicon Valley now, so congrats to them. But on a little bit deeper level, and thinking about AI in healthcare and other fields, we often have heavily regulated industries, right? Healthcare is no exception to those, and we really lean on the FDA to be responsible for safety and efficacy. And I think that going back to the earlier definition we talked about, for AI, when things are continually learning, continually evolving, we no longer have locked software platforms, which is what the FDA has traditionally regulated when we think about software as a medical device, or SAMDA, which is what we typically call it in the industry. And so really the challenge is for both regulators and innovators to understand, when is my follow-on filing? When has this changed enough such that I need to go back to my regulatory body, whether it's here in the EU, and actually make some changes? Now, certainly, there's two categories of software, and we kind of talked about it a little bit before in terms of, making clinical decision support and then making diagnostic decisions. Certainly, one of the leaders in that space is Arteris, who received the first FDA approval for deep learning in 2016, and they have received several follow-on approvals for their clinical decision support. It took about 2 years later for the first company to receive clinical diagnostic approval, meaning that it's autonomous AI. And that was really done by IDXDR, which is looking at autonomous detection for diabetic retinopathy, which is really doing like a pre-diabetes screen. Mm-hmm. Certainly, when we think about these really seem like niche areas, right? But as a whole, we're really seeing healthcare move to prevention and general wellness. When I don't own an Apple Watch, but for those of you who do, your Apple Watch itself has two algorithms that are regulated by the FDA as a medical device, using the electrocardiogram measurement as well as the irregular rhythm detection algorithm. So those are two things right there that are just no longer niche pieces of software devices, if you will. They're actually regulated technology that have kind of merged with a consumer wearable. But I would turn it back to you, Achuta, to really talk about, what's the technology underlying that, and how does that move from, a research-based realm to a meaningful commercial product?
Boy, yeah, that's a tough question, but I guess that's why we're here to talk about it. There are two stages here. There's a fundamental technology, and then there's moving towards something like a product, or potentially starting a company, which we can segue the conversation into. But starting with the fundamental technology, I think what's really great about the academic process is in academia, our criteria for getting papers in top venues is the work novel? Is there something technically new to the work, and is it better? Is it an improvement in some way? And if you look at it, these are the same questions that VCs or venture capitalists or investors are going to ask any startup about their core technology in the early rounds. Now, In terms of brass tacks, how do you, create novel algorithms or things like that? That's the hard question because you can't patent an algorithm. An algorithm is very difficult to patent. But what you can do is you can kind of patent the steps of a system. So for example, if you talk about the diabetic retinopathy, you can start to protect your process of how you collect the data, which typically use fundus cameras to collect these images. I assume you mean the back of the retina, for example. That's one way that they diagnose it. So you can start from the instrument, how that instrument then uploads to a cloud, how there's privacy controls, for example, such that patient data is not directly seen by engineers or algorithms. And so there's techniques from MIT called federated learning or split learning that are being pioneered. So there's a lot of infrastructure, and that's where a lot of the differentiating factors in starting an AI company are towards these problems. Once you have this and then you have some results, which often happen in academia and in a paper, you get two benefits. First is you have a raw technology. It's the T squared, right? It's the technology and the team. You have the raw technology, and then in a university ecosystem, you have a team of people who are literally looking for their next jobs. So you're able to actually go and create something using that ecosystem. And we can talk about how from here, the T squared, then you go to something like a product.
Yeah, and that's a great segue, Achuta, because actually, we could talk a little bit about Akasha and sort of how did you assemble your team for your startup, and what did that process look like?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, there are many ways to doing a startup. As a professor, I do have bias, disclaimer number one on day number one of class. But, in my case, it was T squared. So we invented a technology that enables cameras to essentially see the world around it and digitize it in 3 dimensions in a way that was much higher resolution than LiDAR. And this really high quality input of a data stream enables robots to go and pick up objects. So we now interface robotic arms so they go and grasp and assemble objects and parts. And so we have a company called Akasha Imaging. This is the background. It's a warehouse, so it's a little cold in here. But the company is now building these robots, which are shipping to customers who are using it to assemble the essential goods and services during COVID-19 while factories are shut down. But if I go back to the technology was started in a university, took a number of years. It was more than one paper that was developed on this technology, and eventually it just reached a critical point where we realized it could help people. And at that point, we had already created a team because we had co-authored that paper with a few co-authors who were really interested in taking it forward. So we didn't have to do that typical matchmaking to find the right team of co-founders. We'd already worked with them in the trenches for a number of years on the technology. So that was how we started Akasha. After that, of course, there's a lot of steps to get initial investment, then Series A, and then kind of grow the company. But it really started at the university with the technology and the team.
That's great. And I think kind of, one thing you sort of touch on when we're thinking about bringing technology out of a university, often intellectual property is involved. And, I know that from, the research side, there's always the, do I patent before I publish? What's the order? And then further on downstream, you might be thinking about what do I patent? What is trade secret? Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like for you and how you sort of knew? Who did you go to for help, or did you kind of have all the answers? How did you figure out that process for your particular venture?
Yeah, this is a hard question, and if you answer the question wrong, it can kind of kill a startup, right? If you go and try to patent something that is your core idea, and then Google sees that patent, they might be able to have the resources to reproduce it better. So you would have been better off with a trade secret. On the other hand, investors, funding ultimately is the lifeblood of a company to a large degree, and investors like to see protection in terms of patents for the core IP. So if Google then goes and patents it before you patent it, then that's also an issue. So it's kind of like a catch-22, which do you pick? So you have to really go with your feel. And I can give you the rule that I use. The rule that I typically use is if there's a unique hardware component or infrastructural step, then I patent it. If there's a cool mathematical operation or algorithm that is super critical to making this work, I don't want other people to see that equation. So I would kind of keep that as a trade secret just to grow my business in that way. So that would be the steps I would take. And of course, once you have customers and you're developing a good product for the world, then you can be a little bit more collaborative. But as an early stage company, you have to be kind of scrappy about keeping things close to the vest. So that's how I look at patents versus trade secrets. Patents, if you're comfortable with it getting out and you need the protection. Trade secrets, if you've got this little catch in your system, this little, folk wisdom that only you know in your head, maybe you want to keep that to yourself until you at least get that initial funding for your company. So I think this is true for AI in an artificial intelligence company or robotics company. It's a pattern I see that my friends often use as well. But Jennifer, you might be better positioned to speak to both how does this differ like for a health tech startup, and actually just out of my own curiosity, what are the key milestones that a founding team should start to hit if they want to start a health tech company? In contrast.
Yeah, those are two really great questions. I think that kind of biting off the first one, we look at AI in healthcare. We just talked about regulatory, and you were thinking about regulators, and all of a sudden there's a black box, and we want transparency into how is this working? How are we guaranteeing safety and efficacy? It often becomes a little bit of a trade-off on how do you assure regulators that this is a standalone algorithm that can produce reliable results and be considered safe and efficacious, whether you're in class 1, class 2, class 3 device. But there's other considerations as well, and you talked about some of those, such as data storage, data privacy. Luckily, there's many companies that you can outsource some of these particular parts of your business to, right? Cloud storage, Amazon Web Services. Even HIPAA compliance. There's companies you could outsource that to as well. Data access often becomes a big one in healthcare because in general, large health systems aren't really just going to open up their EMR to you, and then you might be able to get data out. But then, what do we want back into our EMR, right? In terms of where the veracity of that data that's coming back into an EMR, and who's touched that data and who's processed that data. So it's a little bit of like push in and push out in terms of the data access and the privileges around what data flows in and out of an EMR. And certainly, I think one of the biggest ones, and you might as consumers, we all see this with the monetization of advertising in tech, but the monetization and ownership of healthcare data. We fundamentally assume that, patients own their own healthcare data, but at the end of the day, there are algorithms and other software platforms being built off of healthcare data. And whether or not that's part of the current patient participation in the healthcare system, we haven't really gotten there yet. There are certainly hubs and other apps in which you can share your genomic data or share other kinds of data, healthcare data, but we haven't quite figured out the ownership and monetization piece. But I fundamentally say that ownership of data is probably the same across all sectors, if you will. But I think that one of the things that we're seeing in terms of your second part of your question about what does it take, what are the milestones to start a health tech company, I think that IP is important. I think that traction is perhaps even more important. And what I see, and we talked about this prior to the call today, but there's often a little bit of a higher bar for health tech or healthcare companies that are in the software space. And that's by nature of healthcare as a whole, probably when looking at the venture industry. But I think that one of the things we've seen in terms of trends is that accelerators and incubators have kind of swelled to fill that gap in terms of the funding piece between VC and academic research. Certainly at a leading academic medical center like UCLA, data is kind of part of the DNA of our ecosystem. So for those of you that are at large academic centers or large universities, I would certainly encourage you to take advantage of the data that's available to you, because once you got into the real world, that real world data, I would argue, becomes a lot more expensive, a lot harder to come by, because you have to have scale to get real world data and real world evidence.
Awesome. So I think, in your answer, you're talking a lot about advantages that university has. We've talked about like the team, finding like team members, access to initial types of data, probably also some technology from like, computer scientists who are like floating around campus and stuff like that. What should people like people who are viewing this talk, let's say, what if they're not at a university, how should they approach this process of starting a company in health tech, particularly one that requires connections to a hospital, a vibrant ecosystem like UCLA?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that often, one of the biggest things in terms of starting a company is, you talked about the T squared, team technology. Certainly team is the other half. And I do think that having a clinical champion, having a clinical counterpart is often not necessary, but it can be a really it can be an accelerant, right? To have that clinical voice at the table in the early stages of company formation. So I think that in terms of leveraging your ecosystem, right? So leveraging regional parts of your ecosystem, in the world of COVID, those are virtual right now, of course, but really thinking about ways to identify physician entrepreneurs through societies like the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs, which has an LA chapter and chapters around the nation. That's a great way to find clinicians who are interested in entrepreneurial activities. And I know we have a robust chapter here in LA for the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs. But even at your local universities, UCLA has many events. Even UCLA Biodesigm, we have events to meet clinicians. And often, residents and fellows have time. Doesn't necessarily need to be the leading KOL or a head of a society. That could be your first ask. There are trainees within all specialties who are interested in innovation, so they might be good networks as well to think about when looking for co-founders in the space. How do you typically, I know that you sort of had the dream team assembled from day one, it sounds like, but what advice would you give to, I know particularly from the healthcare side, we're always looking for the opposite. We want the people with the tech skills. So where do we find those folks?
Well, I think it's exactly the opposite. So if we're starting a health tech venture, which I haven't done personally yet, but I hope to one day, I know it's going to require a lot more than engineering stakeholders, a lot more. And this is where we're actually looking, for partnerships like Biodesigm and similar initiatives that are being run at UCLA. But how would I approach it if I wasn't at a university and I wanted to start a company, whether in health or whether in robotics or AI? Something interesting. I do think that there's a big advantage to having some sort of a network. That could be a university network. It could also be like founded by ex-Google alums or ex-Facebook alums. It gives you that just connection to the pain points that the industry is facing. It gives you connection to that team aspect. So I would kind of go so far as I don't want to discourage people from doing their first startup, but if I was recommending something to a family member, I would say, hey, look, if your intention is to do a startup, you're going to be like fundraising for a whole year without pay if you don't have the right team and technology lined up. Might as well work for a year and then try to see, if you can position some of the networks that you've built into a company. So that's the way I would look at it is, and universities have these programs now, like Biodesigm, for example. I think, you just mentioned how you engage with non-UCLA community, right? They're still part of the community. And in engineering, especially at Stanford, is very popular for this. There will be professors who have research labs. Traditionally, only PhD students are in research labs or postdocs, but they would actually allow industry volunteers to spend 20 hours a week. They would be unpaid, but they would be sitting there in the group meetings in the network. I haven't seen that yet at UCLA, but that's maybe something that we can consider.
Well, I'm sure they'd want to come to your lab. So, so if that's an open invitation, we can make that known on the session here today. I know we have about 10 minutes or so left. So if folks in the audience have questions, please text them in to us. I think one of the things that's sort of top of mind for both Achuta and I is how the startup ecosystem is going to change, post-COVID. We've seen sort of record fundraising numbers, a fairly robust public market in the past few months. Achuta, do you have any? You're in the valley. You're living it right now. What are you seeing? What are you feeling from the ecosystem there?
It went in waves. Like when we were fundraising in March, a lot of investors and customers, there was a lot of uncertainty in the market, and nothing scares investors more than uncertainty. They're okay if it's a down market. They're okay if it's an up market, obviously, but uncertainty is what makes them hold on to their pocketbooks. So I think that for the past 4 months, there has been kind of this flat zone where people are still investing, and now we're actually starting to get into another uncertainty period with the election coming up. So I guess the bottom line I would say is anytime, it's okay if the market is tanking. It's okay if the market is going up. It's great if the market is going up. But if you don't know which way the market is going, then assume the investors don't know, and then they don't know how to set valuations, and that's when they stop taking meetings. So uncertainty is the killer, as opposed to a positive or negative market.
Yeah, and I feel like, especially in our current kind of time of crisis or crisis recovery, which we're hopefully heading towards, so many industries have been affected that typically are immune to recession, immune to periods of economic depression. So certainly, speaking from the healthcare side, I think that we've seen urgent needs within the COVID space, and seeing that you're a leading researcher in AI, in robotics. How do you think that this particular technology set can help sort of in the time of COVID? What have you seen being most impactful, most successful?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I'm going to actually set aside the health side because I think you can speak better to that. But on the robotics side, now is kind of really that time where factories are shut down anyway. So they are now retooling their factories for automation. So automation is now exploding as a startup vertical to go after, because fundamentally our society is not only trapped due to a pandemic, but also limited availability of goods and services. Just as one example, like there's like a 700% increase in demand for barbells, right? Because people can't go to gyms. So now everywhere you're out of stock of barbells, and that's been true for like 4 months. So there are many of these kinds of goods and services that people want, but they're just not able to, the supply is not able to be met. So I think robots producing meaningful goods and services for our health, our wellness, and our happiness is definitely going to be an active area during the time of COVID.
That's sweet. I won't ask you if you have a pair of barbells under your desk. I want to put you on the spot. But I think in thinking about COVID and healthcare, we've seen even just the technology for the contact proximity, contact tracing using Bluetooth beacons coming out of Lucerne and being licensed by Google and Apple to place on phones. Certainly, software and technology as a whole is placing a lot of optimism in terms of how we might be able to do tracing as well as infection prevention, and talk about automation and replacement of human tasks. Contract tracing is like taking a census. It's a door to door. It's following up. It's going through a list, and certainly the ability of technology to help with contact tracing and being able to minimize the need for that arduous process of following up in large nations such as the U.S. and others. It can have a great impact, certainly. And we're also seeing, technology at UCLA. I know Eliezer Eskin is on the speaker list, and he has his own technology that's been launched out of UCLA specific that can tell me if I want to go to the Whole Foods down the street, if I want to go to the Whole Foods in Westwood, and it'll kind of give me a risk-based adjustment factor in terms of my risk of COVID exposure associated with that particular retail site. And so I think that we've seen a lot of great technologies on the tech side, and we'll continue to see more as we think about remote monitoring for either patients that are diagnosed with COVID or patients that are at risk for readmission, in terms of being able to monitor patients at home. Even when we think about the educational sector, right, as we start to send children back to school, how do we monitor all of those children and teachers and people that are going to be interfacing that haven't previously interfaced, and those that are in high-risk groups. So certainly, without technology, I think that the world would be a very different place in the time of COVID.
Totally. So, I can see that your hands are pretty full in the background, regarding the education for youngsters.
This is part of the educational program right here.
So we get 2 speakers from your video chat. 2 for the price of 1. No, I think that's great. I don't see any questions, so I want to ask kind of a provocative question to you, Jennifer. In some ways, like, you're a UCLA faculty member, you found a company, Biodesigm is trending upwards. One of the things that I often see from students is they're intimidated kind of by the successes and then afraid to replicate that and fail. So, how do we talk about startups, I forget the statistic, but like 99% of startup ventures or companies that you form don't work out. And we've talked about all the things that you could do to make it work. What advice do you have for somebody who's afraid of failing at launching a startup?
Yeah, I think that failure is part of the startup process, quite frankly, having gone through it myself and having advised, hundreds of early stage companies in the med tech and health tech sector. But certainly I think that, embracing failure is really important, because failure doesn't mean that, you necessarily are going to perish. It just means you might have to pivot. And within an educational setting, it's a great opportunity to be able to take classes, to join a lab, to be able to think about, how do I start exercising those entrepreneurial pieces of the framework? And also thinking about, how can I find the right people? Because often you might find the team before the idea, right? So sometimes it's not even about finding the right technology and seeing if you can de-risk that technology, but sometimes it's just finding the people who are really interested in making an impact or a change in a specific sector or area. And I think that, we talked a little bit about, leveraging your network to do those things. And really, acknowledging failure and celebrating failure is an important part of the culture at any organization. And I think that, specific to medicine and healthcare, that might be a little bit of a foreign part of the training practicum. But certainly through the Biodesigm program, we work on teaching the Biodesigm framework that was developed at Stanford, and how to stepwise de-risk a process for innovation. I think that's applicable. Those design thinking tenets are applicable to any sector and any industry. But I would turn it over to you for maybe some closing remarks on how to achieve that successfully and embrace failure and find success in startups.
No, I think actually, there's something to be said about, you never want to end a talk or anything like that on a negative note with the word failure. But that's exactly why you should end it with the word failure, because it should not be seen as a negative. It should be seen as a positive. And one of the things I often tell students, this is just a personal opinion, but there are a lot of UCLA students that are gunning for the internship at Google or the internship at Amazon or Facebook. And that's terrific, and they should continue to do that. For the students that don't take that path and do a startup, they're afraid of failing it. They're afraid of failing, and then potentially they have a gap in their work history, and then now they can't go to a Facebook or an Amazon or a Google. And I'd like to tell people that from my experience, this is actually not true, that many times these large companies, they actually, if you choose to go back there after failing at doing a startup, many times they look upon that more favorably than taking that very linear path. So, failure is a positive thing. And I'll close with the motto of our first electrical engineering 101, which I teach. It's weeder class. A lot of the grades are pretty low, set by the department. But what we talk about on the first day of class is not knowing is part of the fun, right? So similarly, failure is part of the fun, and don't be afraid to fail. So that would be how I would end the.
I don't know if I'm going to take that class, but maybe the first one you talked about, I don't know if I'll make it through the weed out process. But I'll just kind of close by thanking you, Achuta, for the discussion today. And certainly those interested in entrepreneurship, the UCLA Biodesign Fellowship is accepting applications through October 30th. And those with computer science, engineering, clinical sales, design skills, I encourage you to apply and visit biodesign.ucla.edu to learn more. So thank you, Achuta, and I'll maybe just take you up on the sitting in on a lab session. But are those an industry that you might have a call out to as well for partnership or other activities?
Yeah, so our website is visual.ee.ucla.edu, kind of a mouthful, but feel free to visit that webpage, send me an email if you attended this talk, and look forward to connecting. So thanks so much for your time and listening.
Likewise.
And thanks so much, Jennifer. All right.